Until a couple of years ago, I thought, like most people nowadays, that yes, there are so many unexplained ancient mystery sites and artifacts. So there must have been some ancient civilization that got lost, erased by time, right? What else? But then the events in my life developed in such a way that even to my own surprise, I embarked on the project of putting all these mysteries and unexplained artifacts and sites next to each other, kind of putting together a big puzzle. But when the pieces were put together, the overall picture, the result, surprised me immensely. It wasn't a very old lost civilization. It turned out that we are that civilization and we have lost ourselves, and not in some faraway ancient times, but very recently. And then, as one thing led to another, I found myself organizing also expeditions. I visited Spain, Italy, and Malta. And from what I saw over there out in the fields with my own eyes, it became absolutely clear that if we want to know where do we come from, we should not start with the assumption that we need to add lost civilization. What we'll have to do is rewrite the history thoroughly from scratch, because it seems that what we have been told in school for the history of the, let's say, the past 200 years would be more or less correct, let's say roughly 80%. And then, as far as the alleged events that took place from 200 to more or less 500 years ago, the times of the Reformation, would be more or less half true. And then the history as we know it about the events which took place some more than 500 years ago, a couple of thousand years ago, that is like, let's say, 10 or 15% true. Now, I understand that such a level of inaccuracy would be difficult to accept for most people. That's why what I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna show you various groups of ruins, one after another, and then at the very end, I hope that you will agree with me that our history has been tempered with to a far bigger extent than what even most alternative history researchers believe. The polygonal megalithic stonework of South America is a very well-known mystery. But is there any real grounds to suggest that it is very ancient, possibly even thousands of years old, when just by looking at it, it appears actually brand new? The erosion is minimal or absolutely absent. Of course, in these particular examples, we may deal with a very hard variety of stone, but what about these stone structures from the Middle East? They could reach quite an impressive height, by the way. You can compare them to the size of the trees next to them. They easily reach the height of a building that is a couple of stories high. This particular example is from a site called Horvat Karta, one out of the hundreds examples of such sites all over the Middle East. And the important thing here that they are also cut into rocks which are of the same hardness as those famous megaliths in South America. So the stone that they're made of is of the same hardness, yet look at the scale of their erosion. It cannot even be compared to the newish looking South American megaliths. Actually, many of them were buried and some are still buried with layers of earth. Also, notice another difference. The South American megaliths are nicely located on the current ground level, while these are in cases below it. And actually, the parts that were exposed, they got affected or completely eaten up by erosion, disappeared completely. And those that were buried and later on got exposed, that is what is left of these structures. The low quality repairs on the top obviously belong to a different culture altogether, because they have been placed on a surface which was already heavily affected by erosion. Hundreds of sites of this type lay out there in the fields. Nobody has ever studied them seriously, but it shouldn't be that way if we really want to know the truth about our past. They deserve much more attention. Their sheer size is absolutely impressive, and they are very, very old, although we don't have actually any reliable dating methods at all, because all the official dating methods are based on assumptions and guesses. But still, in this case, the erosion testifies as of their extreme age. Just think, these are some of the hardest varieties of rocks. How long would it take that meters of it gets eroded? This is very long time. If the data on the speed of erosion that you can find in the modern official books on geology is correct, which I don't think is the case, not even at the slightest. But if it was, then this structure would be easily a couple of millions of years old, or at least hundreds of thousands. According to mainstream geology, in the case of the hard varieties of rocks, we are talking in terms of millimeters of erosion per 1,000 years. The famous mysterious polygonal stonework, which is not found only in South America, also many fine examples in Turkey, in the south of Europe, in Siberia, in Khmer, nowadays Cambodia, and many other places. It did not just appear out of nowhere. There is a clearly visible continuation in the building techniques which gradually developed or devolved from the rock cut ruins that I showed earlier, and the intermediary stage are what I call elf castles, just because the castles or fortresses built with the use of this technique are usually always on the top of the hills with fantastic views. These so-called elf castles blend so well with nature that from far away there is nothing man-made. That's how it looks like, and only when you go in it you start gradually realizing that these are not just cracks in the stone, these are megalithic blocks. For example, this is an absolutely regularly shaped hexagonal block that has fallen down. Now, this was an example of a relatively exceptionally well preserved elf castle. Fortresses, rock cut fortresses, with often with elements of giant megaliths mixed together with the rock cutting, are also found all over Asia Minor, the Balkans, and southern Europe, reaching all the way to Switzerland and the south border of France even. I've been trying to collect all the elf castles that I could find out about on my website in the directory of all interesting megaliths in the elf castle category. Interestingly enough, such curious ruins are absolutely under the radar even for the alternative history researchers. And one of the main reasons for it is that usually there is something much more recent built on the top of the ruins of what once has been an elf castle. Even when people see that there is a different style of construction at the bases, they tend to assume, oh, they must have cut the rock just there at the basis and then continue building on the top. But after people heard about elf castles from my videos and started looking at the ruins around with a more critical eye, they reported many other examples in which it was clear, no, this is not just cutting the rock for the purpose of building a base for the medieval fortress or whatever is built on it. This was an older building which was already in ruins by the time they started the construction of the younger generation building on the top of it. And although I'm calling these fortresses, or in some cases they're even in the size of small towns, with a name from the fairy tales, finding them is much easier than one would expect. For example, we were visiting this very poorly preserved site of such elf castle, like rock-cut ruins in Spain, and then we noticed that there is another hill in the vicinity, again with the picturesque views to the valley. And then we thought, oh, they usually go in groups of couple of elf castles next to each other. So let's go and visit the other hill as well. Maybe it will have another elf castle on it. This is, by the way, an example of something of a remains of a round door. Maybe it was a rotating door. So this was the other hill. And we went there, we drove there. And as we reached and I opened the door of the car, this is what I saw right at the parking lot. Remains of heavily eroded, I don't know, rooms or some sort of premises. Something rock cut, obviously of intelligent design. And the wall, which you see here, which happens to be the defensive wall of the medieval castle. So obviously the older rectangular cutting was not done here to support the castle wall. It bears no connection with the idea of such a wall, and all around there were ruins of this sort that bared no connection whatsoever with the castle that was built on obviously what was already severely ruined at that time. Just one out of the 100 examples. On the left, you see a smoothened by erosion staircase or some sort of cuttings, and on the right, you see the defense walls of the castle. So, what happens in reality is that tourists do visit such places and they read the official boards which assure them that this is, for example, a medieval castle or a Roman building or built by some unknown tribe and so on and so forth. And they naively believe this. And even when they notice, and that happened to me a few decades ago. I was actually in Turkey and I noticed this is very strange. This doesn't look connected to what's written there. It's weird. So, at most, what people tend to do is to sometimes notice that it is weird and it doesn't match up with the rest of the stories they're telling us. But once we manage to raise this awareness that most of the so-called history that we were taught in school is lies craftily mixed with semi-truth and fiction, then people may become somewhat more mindful when they look at historic ruins and artifacts. So, Baalbek in Lebanon is another very famous mystery site, and yet I'm not at all convinced that it gets the attention it deserves in terms of proper meticulous research. It seems that most people who go there to look at it arrive already preloaded with these ideas of either aliens or lost very old civilization, as if these are the only two options. And so such limiting ideas already serve as blinders, and when they go there, they concentrate almost exclusively on the trilitons, which are really impressive, no doubt about it. But what about the rest? Here on the top of the trilitons, we see a wall that is of a distinctly different character. And so, based on such a partial observation, they return back and say, oh, the older stuff is very different and we don't know anything about that lost civilization. And it serves as a confirmation for the hypothesis that they already arrived with. But in reality, if we look around, we'll notice very interesting stuff in the so-called Roman parts of Baalbek. Actually, the entire inner courts of the large complex is also with very impressive size blocks made of them. And yet the alternative researchers don't tend to pay so much attention to them just because they are already labeled as Roman. That means not interesting. So anything that bears this style officially labeled as Roman passes below the radar without any examination at all. Like, for example, absolutely unhumanly giant columns, some of which are a single piece of stone. Some of them are even sparkle polished, which shouldn't have been possible if the alleged Romans who built it were the way we are told they were. We also have metal armature and pipes sticking out of the stones. And also in those Roman labeled parts of Baalbek, we have tool marks identical to those left by the tools that nowadays we call high-tech. And most importantly, in the inner courts of Baalbek, there is no clear boundary visible between the old giant stuff and the stuff labeled as Roman. Yes, there is plenty of evidence that there was an original building which got destroyed one or more times and was rebuilt and renovated and remodeled. We even don't know how many times. That is clear, but the point that is often missed out is that it's definitely not like there was something high-tech and very huge and then it got destroyed and then the small primitive people came and tried to renovate it. Not at all. The degradation of building techniques is definitely gradual. We have been losing our knowledge gradually. This is the important point. And this is not just in Baalbek, also in South America. Yes, we have the really fantastic, huge megaliths, and then we have the very primitive Inca work, but there is tons of stuff in between. You can't even categorize it. So even there, this degradation was not like a sudden gap. The same thing in Turkey, in Italy, in Greece. Multiple layers showing gradual degradation. The high-tech tool marks get less and less, and the buildings last less and less. It always amazes me how the polygonal stonework became synonymous and almost equivalent in the minds of many people to lost, very old civilization if it was obviously used by relatively recent cultures. One out of the many examples are the numerous temples of the Khmers. Most definitely, we see polygonal work, each and every stone with size and shape of its own, nothing standard. So apparently there was a connection between these very old mysterious megaliths and relatively recent cultures. It's not just the polygonal shape of the stone blocks. Here we see the typical clams, same as those seen in Peru, Turkey, Greece, and so many other places. Pyramids, which make you feel as if you're in Central America. And also the very technique of building. All over the world we see the same thing. Blocks that are perfectly polished on the inside. And thus they fit each other with amazing precision. And even minor details in the building techniques match. Like, for example, this peculiarity that they would first place the stones on their places and after that they would shape them, all of them together. For example, this line has been obviously cut in the stone after the stones were already on their places. This is very commonly used. It's well known in Egypt, also in South America. So this and countless other parallels show that we are talking about a worldwide culture or civilization. And this wasn't in some faraway forgotten times, but very, very recently. Here in Angkor Wat, we have some of the original wooden doors even still standing, although they were out there in the open. And the climate is so warm and hot there, things rot very fast. That much recent stuff we are talking about. But unfortunately, it will be quite some time from now when the majority of people will become aware of their real past, just because from early childhood we are taught to always remain in this comfort zone and believe in the things that we've been taught when they were small, or in the things that most people believe in, even when they contradict the reality. And that is why very few people are ready to even consider an entirely different version of history, a version in which even as recent as a couple of 100 years ago, there were still isolated pockets of people who remembered a lot from the past, not only in terms of building techniques, but also much more important stuff like where did we, the humans, come from and why are we here? And by the way, something else very, very interesting that I observed on the old Khmer buildings is how we stopped building with huge megalithic blocks. It was again gradual. As we degraded gradually, the blocks got smaller and smaller, resembling bricks more and more, but they were still polygonal. Look at this. This is not your standard size brick. Here, this is probably somewhere exactly in the middle between polygonal stonework and bricks. Still, we can see how, for example, the small bricks, they were specially shaped, particularly for the noses of the characters that were being depicted. Also, it can be observed that first the bricks were placed and then the corners were cut and shaped, which is also a technique inherited by the time of the fantastic megaliths. In this case, probably it was done manually, but still it is a proof that the knowledge was getting lost gradually. And there are so many hundreds, if not thousands, of such examples. It's impossible to mention all of them even briefly in 1.5 hours. But if you're interested, I have a documentary of over 40 episodes called The Survivors of Atlantis, where I have collected countless evidence that all these stories that we were told in school about ancient cultures and all kinds of kingdoms, although all they have some sort of small percentage of truth in them, some seed of truth, the overall accuracy of the full story, of the big picture especially, is far less than that of the bad stories that your mother has been telling you when you were small. Just two more points about the old Khmer buildings. Initially, the statues were carved out of stone, of course, and then they were cut into the bricks gradually. That was the technique. And at the end, they consisted of a rough brickwork on the inside, the bulky part, and then a smoother finishing with cement on the top. Here we have somewhat less cement left. Well, this is an example where the cement is far better preserved. And this was a very commonly used technique all over Southeast Asia. For example, this is in Thailand, Ayutthaya. And in Bagan, Burma. It is well known that it was used in the very same way in the so-called Roman buildings and widely used, for example, in the European Renaissance castles and in Teotihuacan in Mexico. Yes, it was very widely used in the same way, and it was a very strong brand of cement, so to say, still holding at places. Now, if you visit the parts of Teotihuacan that has been prepared for tourists, you may get a very wrong impression about it because all this is 100% modern construction and it reflects the idea of a certain artist who was told that it should have looked like that. But if you go in an areas where there are still parts of the old stuff left, the walls are covered with a thick layer of cement. And in those rare examples where there is something of the real old stuff left, around buildings like this, there are very huge squares, and all of them are cemented with quite a thick layer of cement. This is just one small example out of the thousands which prove that there was a lot of intercontinental travel, and not just in very ancient times. It was like this practically all the time. And one last point from the Khmer buildings. It is not unique to Khmer. We see it almost everywhere where there is a restoration attempt. Just observe the striking difference between the quality of the old artwork and the modern one, if I can call it even artwork. Just look at this, as if monkeys did it. The color matching, the gaps between the stones, the so-called design we have made. And on the top of all that, we believe that we are advancing and that people centuries ago were backwards and stupid. Let's do a simple math. Now, the population is much more than in those times, and the taxes are many times higher, probably, let's say, at least 6 or 7 times. And on the top of that, everyday people come from all over the world and purchase extremely expensive entry tickets to the temples, popularly known as Angkor Wat, which amounts to quite few millions every year going into their restoration. And add to all that our labor now is supposedly much more efficient because we have computers that would design the perfect elements that would match perfectly. We have tools with which we can cut stone much easier and much faster. So if we were really that much superior, why can't we even repair a simple broken piece, let alone building it from scratch? Now, an interesting connection with Baalbek can be made in modern St. Petersburg in Russia. So, probably many of you already think, yeah, but this is neoclassical style. People felt nostalgia for the graceful forms of the antiquity, and they started just imitating and building in the same style. Yes, that is the official story we are told, but does it mean it's really true just because somebody said so and wrote so? For example, this is a comparison of an original column in Baalbek with a column from St. Petersburg. And another parallel between a building in St. Petersburg and its counterpart in Greece. So in both cases, we are told by the official books that all the stuff in St. Petersburg was built by absolutely uneducated, illiterate peasants who have never seen art of this style before in their lives, but a couple of young chaps came all the way from Europe and told them all about it. And the peasants started making these masterpieces. And it's not just the fine art. Those peasants really must have meant business because they erected with absolutely primitive means, allegedly, megaliths and columns. The columns being heavier than those of Baalbek. Just to give you a proper perspective of the size, this is St. Isaac's Cathedral. And this is a close-up of the base only of the columns. And this is the lower row. And these are the small ones on the top. Everything is monolithic, of course. the peasants who allegedly built all this went as far as even using the same techniques as those used supposedly in deep antiquity. Here is your polygonal stonework, no standard size for the blocks, which by the way are of a very hard variety of granite. So how did the peasants know even minor details about the technique used by allegedly civilizations, cultures that are gone many centuries ago? Here we see the same appearance as if first the blocks were placed and then the cuttings in them were made. So in recent years, some people in Russia thought, this is interesting. So our forefathers were building such an amazing stuff couple of years ago. Basically, there should have been some documentation left. Maybe this will help solve the mysteries about the same megaliths that were built in deep antiquity. So when they started their research, first of all, it transpired that all the original documents in terms of any details of how actually the building was done from the builders is absolutely missing. There isn't a single piece. And most of the stories about the architects and the people who allegedly took part in the construction actually don't have any tangible proof at all. They would be mentioned in the modern history books, often with prolific details about their lives, but there would be no reference of any source of this information. And when you try to find information from other sources, it turns out that this is like a phantom person who never existed or lived at a different time. It wouldn't be suspicious if a couple of the people never married and never left a family behind that would commemorate them or have any connection with them. But when all the people involved are like that, it starts looking fishy, the full thing. But forget about the people. Let's talk about the actual technology, the techniques used. How did they do it? How did they place these big columns? How did they transport them? Well, the answer to all this that is to be found in the official modern history books is highly unsatisfactory and often defies common sense. For example, it is said that they erected the biggest columns, pulling it with ropes, for 2 hours. Well, just for a comparison, similar or even smaller columns need a couple of days nowadays, and that is with the help of the most advanced cranes that we have at our disposal nowadays. And then for example, they show paintings allegedly done at that time by eyewitnesses, by painters who were assured they were looking and painting. But if that was really true, how is it possible that a couple of artists saying so completely different things as if they were in different towns at that time? And some were painting, erecting of a column, others were painting a minor repair on an old structure. So it is suspicious from all sides, and especially the claim that this type of quality of artistic work can be done by absolute savages. Explicitly, they teach the Russian children at school quotes, like this is the most important information that they teach in school, is that this was done by people who have never even heard of any measurement units, what to speak of having any education or being literate. So they're offering us to believe that somebody who has no clue how to build anything than a straw hut has engineered this megaliths. These are absolutely huge monolithic blocks. These are multi-storied buildings. You really need team of engineers to put all this together. And it's not just couple of columns. It's an absolutely large complex of palaces. So in each and every one of these palaces, we have items made of so many different materials. They need to be manufactured at specialized places for this. So how would the sizes match? How would you manufacture a gold-plated fitting for the green column if you don't know even how to count and you don't know what is a measuring unit? How will you know how big is the column? And by the way, such complex compositions, they require some sort of engineering project. Yeah, something written down in detail, how big it should be so that it can get manufactured. Where is all this? Why there is no trace of it even? Actually, the only source on which the mainstream stories are loosely based are a number of illustrations in an album which was indeed printed at the time when all this was built, and it was printed in France. The overall impression after looking at this album is that it is some sort of a forgery, an attempt to cover up the real story. Even at that time, it is not a new trend, because it is some sort of a joke, like, look at this man. What he's allegedly doing, he is preparing the stone for the big columns by inserting this metal rod in the rock, and after they insert many such rods, the giant boulder will split from the rest of the bedrock. Okay, sounds brilliant so far, but how do you insert a 5-meter thin metal rod into the solid bedrock? Some technology, some hammer or something? Will it not bend? I mean, there should be some common sense in these things. So here the friends of the hero from the previous image are happily and easily pulling a large boulder as if it is a sack of cotton. Yes, this size of boulders can be transported by primitive means, and this is what the photographs show. Yes, people did it, but this is how they actually did it, with this type of equipment. So can we trust that French album just because it was printed at the same time when all this was allegedly built, or maybe was it repaired? This is the type of equipment that we use nowadays to transport that size of stones. And they are offering us to believe that people were just pulling them on a couple of shoestrings 200 years ago. And the strange things in the official version of the history of all that in Petersburg, there are just too many of them. Here they are transporting the huge columns in ordinary boats. Yes, it is absolutely within the technology a couple of 100 years ago to transport similar things, and they were transported, but they made special ships for it. Here is how a much smaller obelisk was transported by sea. They needed to make a special design of a ship for it. It was that difficult. So why they had to take these absurd stories and present them as sort of scientific history instead of really researching and inquiring into what happened? For example, these are old illustrations where ruins are shown again in this very same St. Petersburg. Look at the ruins, the absolutely same designs that you see in Baalbek. And again, all this happened in very recent times. So the memory should have been alive. What about the people who really knew what actually happened? What happened to their children? And was it really by chance all this communist, supposedly communist project to kill uh, all more educated people and people who had knowledge of everything? Was it really some whim of the communists, or was it a continuation of all this plan that was already in action at the time when the album with the fraudulent illustrations was printed in? And by the way, there is an overwhelming evidence that there wasn't any need for peasants to drag heavy stones like idiots. Most likely, most of this wonderful stuff in St. Petersburg was actually cast out of geopolymer, a mixture that, when hardens, becomes non-different from natural stone. Why did they need to go to such an extent to hide the old techniques from us? And by the way, St. Petersburg is a very small fraction of all the questions about the so-called neoclassical style, which appears to be something completely different than what we are told. Maybe just one more point about the neoclassical buildings. Why are they buried so much with mud? The official explanation is that these are historical layers. My God, so in 200 years the people never swept the street and it piled up. In some cases, it covered even 2 floors of the buildings. Extensive research was done by enthusiasts in Russia, and they found that in the most Russian cities, the buildings were just covered up. And there isn't even a hint about it in the official history. And when I published the first video about this more than a year ago, I got a lot of responses from all over the world, and especially from America, where people reported the same thing. In a number of cities, the buildings are buried, sometimes even 2 floors high, and no mention about it in the official history at all. And of course, in many cities of Europe, it is absolutely the same situation. And some evidence emerged that over there as well, sometimes repairs were fraudulently depicted in the history as actually erecting the buildings. So definitely we are talking about a worldwide forgery of history. Also, around the time when all this happened in America, people sent me very interesting stories of the fires which devastated various big cities, and the explanations of those fires. I mean, they sounded dodgy. Like, for example, we had a fire that tossed trains across a lake, and there were balls of fire flying over the entire area. And the official explanation of all that is that the crops started burning. So I really wonder what kind of crops were those. Probably some trees which bear hand grenades as fruits or something like that. Yet another place where huge polygonal megaliths are part of buildings which belong to our relatively recent past is Japan. And there is yet another class of ruins that is not getting almost any attention at all. And these are the often very large complexes of rock cut ruins, sometimes the sizes of big cities. I even had to coin my own name. I called them the civilization of Igil. Apparently, till now, nobody showed enough interest to the point to give them a name or even make some sort of a list or map of the ruins. This is the first attempt of such a map, and even this contains probably less than 1% of all the sites. Actually, to make it's impossible at the moment to make a comprehensive map because these ruins are so numerous. Like in certain regions of Turkey and central Italy where I visited, they're basically besides or under every village and town. And there are two main reasons for which almost nobody studies them as the remains of a single civilization. And the first reason, as usual, is the blind belief in the stories of the official so-called history about them. Often these stories are utterly ridiculous and devoid of common sense even, absolutely inconsistent with the what you see actually. But yet people tend to believe them, thinking that somebody must have studied something, or at most they would notice this sounds weird, and that's where it would end, because simply there is nobody to tell them that they are ruins with the same style and same age all over the place, spread over continents. The way the official so-called historians deal with these ruins is either ignore them and leave them unprotected so that people destroy them with agriculture, or just they fall apart with time, or they make up some story usually connected with the historic layers that would be built on the top of such ruins, and then it will seem almost like true, and people buy it. They get attributed to all kinds of cultures belonging to all kinds of historic times, from primitive to very recent. And when they can't find any culture handy to blame it on, they just say, or it was monks, they dug it out in the rocks to sit and pray there. And the second reason for which these ruins don't get enough attention, and that is especially valid for the alternative history researchers, is that they are often in a very poor condition. Obviously, they are quite old. And in most cases, they don't look like they're very high tech. And since landing places for saucers are not often found in the vicinity, sites, mostly the alternative history researchers tend to simply pass by. In reality, this network of rock-cut ruins is so durable that it has been used and reused and remodeled by many cultures and civilizations. Many of them are still habitable even till nowadays. Thousands of people still live in them. And even after undergoing numerous total renovations, amazingly enough, distinct layers with their own peculiarities in terms of design, borders, arches, and so on. Such layers are seen in the same sequence on the top of each other, all the way from Spain to Asia Minor. For example, now the images from Spain and Israel, they're from a layer, let's say, that is somewhere in the middle with this typical semicircle arches, or even circle, one could say. So I coined the name Ruins of the Aiguille as a collective name for all the rock cut complexes after the Aiguille castles in the Diyarbakir region of Turkey, very near to the border with Syria. Although most of what was there has obviously disappeared without trace, still we have something extremely rare. Few pieces of architecture have survived the onslaughts of time to show us how did the Aiguille cities look on the outside, so to say, because otherwise always survived the parts that were inside the solid bedrock. The parts that were on the periphery, they fell first with the earthquakes. Here we have some sort of a pyramid. Just to give you an idea of the proportions of the full thing, the line at the background, that's a staircase partially exposed. Looking at the sheer size and complexity of whatever little has remained of this full complex, if not town or metropolis, I personally don't think this could have been done by primitive people, as we are being assured by the mainstream sources. The Aiguille ruins go hand in hand with yet another extremely interesting type of ruins, and these are the rock cut roads. Or at least they look mostly like roads. So I will continue referring to them in that way. They're found basically everywhere in regions where Aiguille ruins are to be found. And they also have their layers. There are older ones and relatively younger ones. And the older the layers, the less can we make sense of them in any way. I mean, first of all, why do you even cut a road in the stone? This is so much work. And often this is done in the fields where you don't have any obstacles. And we're talking about kilometers long roads. It's not just like we do tunnels to avoid some sort of obstacle. No, just kilometers, sometimes even hundreds of kilometers long, even in the absolutely perfect and vehicle friendly terrain. And yes, although what looks like exactly like vehicle tracks is often to be found on such roads, when it is, it gives rise to more questions instead of contributing to some sort of clarity. Okay, so if they are vehicle tracks, then what kind of a vehicle could have used them? Certainly, our cars or carts have no chance in those conditions. Often, the tracks can be knee deep or even over a meter deep. Also, they can be so close to the walls of the road that any vehicle that we know of would get ruined by constantly getting scratched and hitting the walls of the road. And then at places we have such sharp turns that the vehicles that we are accustomed to would either get stuck or ruined. Or even if you find the road that looks somewhat normal and acceptable, excluding the fact that the vehicle has been with one wheel here, and excluding the tractor like marks that even crawl the wall. So let's assume it looks normal for a couple of kilometers and then it turns into something that looks like a pedestrian road, or it has steps or like a staircase. Vehicle tracks are left in the stones, which belong to the relatively more recent historic times, like for example this one, which usually would get categorized like Roman, are somewhat easier to understand. Yes, probably chariots were passing by repeatedly and left these marks. But in other cases, it's very difficult to make sense of it all. Like this is in Turkey, and we are talking of fields entirely covered by a network of hundreds and thousands of tracks. Like you can see how the soft mud splashed when whatever vehicle or we don't know even what passed on this track. So when was that? What kind of vehicle it is? No uh, sign of anything pulling or pushing it or propelling it. Recently, they found one more field entirely covered with such tracks in Turkey. The size is 20 by 40 kilometers. Last autumn, I visited Malta with the intention to see the famous vehicle tracks there, which for some strange reason are famous under the keyword of car routes, although in real life they resemble car routes only very remotely. Well, little did I know that besides the vehicle tracks, I would find something far more interesting. And that was a connection between the Egil ruins and the medieval architecture. It turned out that the medieval star forts in Malta, which are quite impressive, are actually built on the ruins of much older and heavily eroded ruins about which there isn't even a single word or mention in the official history of the forts. I also had a chat with a supposedly proper historian in one of the museums, which, by the way, was located in such a fort. So I asked him, okay, these blocks, the ones in poorer condition, they are medieval. The newish, sparkling one, they're modern restoration. Then what about the stuff below them? What is that? What was there before the medieval work? And he said, oh, yes, there was some culture, unclear who was it, and in terms of how advanced they were, well, maybe they had a obelisk sticking out amongst their huts. So basically, the official version of the history of all this kind of implies that all the rock cutting must have been done in medieval times. But first of all, rock cutting on such an absolutely gigantic scale, actually a full city is cut out of the rock, not only the outside walls, inside as well. This was simply not done in medieval times. And on the top of it, we're most definitely assured by the mainstream sources that the full history of the forts is just documented in great detail completely. And they assure us that there was no major changes in the star forts, at such minor remodelings here and there, but very minor. Yes, basically they are telling us these are medieval walls, and 99% of what you see is authentic medieval stuff, except the small repairs, the modern ones with the shiny, newish looking stone blocks. Now, what one can see over there on the spot in reality is that, yes, the star shaped form is coming from the old stuff, the rock cut, but there was an absolutely thorough remodeling. Even the main entries were at different places in the older rock cut star forts. They had to be closed because obviously the original design did not follow the logic of a medieval defensive port. The stairs were quite welcoming for potential enemies. Apparently, the situation was different at that time. And we noticed this in all the numerous star forts in Malta. Always the older original entries were uh, changed to new places, and new medieval main entrances were built. And practically anywhere you turn, there were changes. Everything was completely remodeled. Here you see the old rock cut steps, something completely different medieval is on the top of them. Another example, and this is the modern restoration. These are the medieval blocks. Then what about the massive rock cut wall? If it was also medieval, then why the medieval blocks embrace a wall that is already destroyed, eroded? And if they were cutting this wall, then why wouldn't they cut also the one on its right side? Why would they remove all that stone to then build another wall if everything was following one single medieval plan, as the mainstream history assures us? For example, this is part of an arch. It's got chisel marks. It even has an official label that it was an arch. So obviously, a lot is missing around this piece of arch that is left. Behind it, there is medieval stuff in good condition, and they're assuring us that before the medieval fortress there were only huts, probably with an obelisk. Is that all? And the situation inside the town is very similar. They had to close the doors and windows in the original rocket structure because the medieval configuration was completely different. Another closed door. You can see remains of staircases, which are now completely absent. These are not isolated cases. It's just everything was totally remodeled, and they're telling us that it was all planned and built in medieval times. It was not. And this is what most of the story that we have been taught in school boils down: semi-truth, cleverly distorted in order to enhance, for example, somebody's political authority, giving them credit for building and inventing things which they actually copied only from the older civilization, or simply creating the illusion that we're a civilization that is constantly developing for the better and is advancing, so to say. So, since I'm running out of time, I want to share the conclusions of my overall research. The main things. What was the need, anyway, to replace the history of an entire planet with sick fantasies? And that's not very easy. They embarked on hundreds of years long project, if not thousands. Why all that? And then, since the history as we know it is mostly fraud, then what is the real history? Of course, the answers to these questions are based on far more research material than I just shared with you. This was just a quick overview of a couple of highlights, a very small part of everything that I managed to collect. So why all this circus of replacing the real history of the entire human race? In short, by making us believe that we are simply descendants of violent apes, and our consciousness is nothing else but a byproduct of chemical reactions, then it becomes much easier to turn us into violent apes without any higher purpose in life or any human sense in life. Because if one believes that he or she is just a large lump of molecules, then it doesn't even matter how do you live your life anyway. But in reality, in our bloodline, we don't have only savage cavemen. There were also other types of beings which most people, if they face them now, they would call them gods. And since we are descendants of those gods, we have an extremely valuable heritage that we can claim in terms of genetic heritage. That would be abilities that we would most likely classify as magical nowadays, which we have and we can use, but they're dormant, they're deactivated. And also, the other form of heritage is the divine knowledge, with the help of which we can live in eternal peace here on earth, a beautiful earth without pollution and without any wars. That is why the parasitic forces in society embarked on this grand project of totally erasing any memory of the times when people openly mixed with the races of gods, when people knew how, with their mental powers to build protective shields around their communities so evil cannot penetrate in any form, and erase the memories of the times when we were using technologies which are more advanced than the ones we have now, and they were based on sound and other environmentally friendly principles. There were ancient books with the real ancient history, but they burned in the huge bonfires during the period that we call Reformation. Now they are representing it as some sort of a religious movement because somebody wanted to translate the Bible into more understandable language and because of church bells and so on and so forth. But in reality, the Reformation was an extremely bloody and long-lasting war against the last remnants of the divine culture, which they have been undermining and making it rot from inside already for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. Their main weapons being ideological infiltration, demoralization of the society, and mainly deceit of any form and description. So around the time of the Reformation, the parasitic forces managed to appoint their own people as kings and rulers of most countries. It started in Western Europe and gradually spread all over the world. These were insurgent kings and queens who also took part in replacing the real history with forgery in order to remain alive, because the rule of law of that time was that if you take the throne without deserving it, the punishment is death. There were pockets here and there of cultures who resisted, and even in military way, and that continued as recent as the 18th century. After the last righteous rulers, who probably also might have kept some of the very old books and certainly knew about the real history, so after they were gone, the common people became citizens of kingdoms with parasitic appointed kings, and they were forced, under the penalty of death, of course, to renounce their old beliefs. Probably the party that now I'm calling parasites are those same race of creatures or race of people, not sure how should I call them, who caused the destruction of Atlantis. They were Atlantean themselves, but they deviated from the path of righteousness and got into black magic technologies and corruption. And when the corruption united with the misuse of technologies, that caused the demise of Atlantis. But it seems many of the Atlanteans escaped and managed to survive the destruction of their land. Some of them were good-hearted, normal Atlanteans who eventually spread all over the planet and educated the primitive tribes that were populating our earth at that time. But also the other type of Atlanteans also survived, a group of them, and they were trying to undermine the good educational mission of the good survivors. And now about the second point, what was the real history? The history that they destroyed in the Reformation bonfires. Well, to be honest, the more I research, and especially the more I go on expeditions, the less I see any point in even making hypotheses about it. We're so far from the truth. We know so little. It is possible to recover everything and is relatively not so difficult, but at least at this point is not something that I can do alone. But still I can recommend a very short reading list with resources that are not perfect, but at least are much closer to the truth than your school history textbook. So, first in this reading list are the Vedic Puranas. They are all translated in English, although lots will be lost in the translation. And anyway, we don't really have them in original form because there were some reforms in the Sanskrit language, but at least they were not as much corrupted as the rest of the old books. Actually, the books that they're telling us are old, like from Roman or even ancient Greek times. They're just medieval creations. None of them is available in original. We have something like copies done by certain small groups of monks. And always when they made the copy, the original disappeared all of a sudden in a fire or some accident. And by the way, the monks honestly admitted that they're copying, but like copying and correcting the books to fit the newly discovered history. Yeah, that's also in the times around the Reformation. But in the case of the Vedic literature, it reached us in a relatively and only relatively less adulterated form. If you try to read it, don't go into any commentaries, just translations of the original text, that's all. And the second item in that reading list would be the works of Anatoly Fomenko. His project called New Chronology, it's a titanic work. It's an attempt to recover the last 1000 years of human history. He doesn't venture at all in times older than 1000 years ago. And although his work is not flawless, it remains the only attempt of compiling a truthful and educated version of the events that took place during the last 1000 years. And although the human race, at least on a collective level, has turned away from the path of the eternal Dharma, the godly guidelines given to us by our engineers, the creators, our benevolent guardians. In the Vedas they are called Adityas. Although we have turned our face away from them, they did not forget us. Our forefathers did not forget us. Because they were magicians, they could see through the veils of time what kind of difficult times will be upon their descendants, and they even left messages for us. I'm just gonna read a few lines from a Hermetic text called The Lament of Hermes. And so the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poorer wretches by force into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds, and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. And then will the earth no longer stand unshaken, the sea will bear no ships, Heaven will not support the stars in their orbits, nor will the stars pursue their constant course in heaven. All voices of the gods will be silenced. But when all this has befallen, then the Master and Father, God, the first before all, the Maker, of that God who first came into being, will cleanse the world from evil, and thus he will bring back his world to its former aspect, so that the cosmos will be once more be deemed worthy of worship and wondrous reverence. And God, the maker and restorer of the mighty fabric, will be adored by the men of that day with unceasing hymns of praise and blessings.